Delivering an impactful presentation is an art form. It's about creating an experience. Your audience has chosen to invest their time in you, and every moment should reflect that commitment with energy, clarity, and purpose. Here are some simple tips from a group of experienced academics. Because being in front of an audience is a bit like theatre, we have also sought the advice of a seasoned YouTuber and comedian, Max Fosh. Firstly, you need to be ready with a great presentation targeted at the intended audience. You should feel comfortable with the subject, your contents, and when to change slides. Here's what our experts think about how to prepare and make a great first impression.
So, presentations is all about knowing your material as best as you possibly can. You need to know what's coming after what you're just saying, so that it doesn't ruin the flow of what you're saying, so you don't stutter. For me as well, it's about running it out verbally as much as possible, because you can write it down, you think you've memorized it, or you think you've learned it, but ultimately the flow of it is remarkably different when you are talking to people out loud.
I think number one, I would say know your audience. Even if you're speaking to a massive crowd of really diverse and different people, or even if perhaps you're pre-recording something not for a specific person, imagine who a typical audience member might be and actually speak to them.
If there's another talk going on beforehand, I like to be in the audience for that so that I can get a sense of the room, a feel for the audience, and just really start to acclimatise to the space.
When I'm physically arriving to deliver a lecture, ideally, I love to be a little bit early, make sure that there's not going to be any technical issues, make sure my presentation's available on a USB, it's always also downloaded on whatever device is available, and just have a good understanding of my environment, the room layout, etc.
Sometimes, preparing your mind is key to a calm and confident delivery. Even seasoned academics have methods to achieve this.
For me, taking some breaths, doing some breathing exercises, just a mindful moment is a really good way of centering myself. I try not to make any last-minute changes to things that I've prepared, because that it's not the time to do it. So for me, it's just about breathing, being in the moment, and then going out onto the stage to do what I need to do.
I like to prepare myself by trying to feel calm enough that when I step onto the stage or press record, I feel present with my audience. And a lot of that is about not trying to cram in last-minute things and just saying, okay, let it go, I'm here now, what I've got is going to be great.
Rehearse timings, tone, and volume. Our advice is to show some passion about your subject. Don't speak too fast. Project your voice to the back of the room. Let your personality shine through.
I'm particularly fond of not really using a lot of slides, so reducing the amount of words and the amount of slides to the bare minimum. And the technique actually I like the most is Pecha Kucha, where you have 20 slides which are only images, which you can describe for 20 seconds each. So you have short presentations that really just focus on the ideas behind the presentation rather than the details.
I try to keep things relatively flexible in terms of timing. It may be that there's a slide which has more detail on it. Maybe it's a graph that I need to talk through in more detail, so that might take longer. There might be other slides which are there really as a something to just break up the pace of a presentation. So I'm less worried about time on a slide.
I think the easiest way to kind of get a good understanding of these things that are specific to you is just to record yourself, have people give you feedback. And sometimes these are things that you can change easily. So it might be having a clearer background, not having distractions. It could be the glare of the sun, for example. It could be your positioning and the setup of your workstation and your camera, volume of your microphone. So some of these are just technical issues. And then some of them are about you as a presenter.
I try to make particular point, a single point per individual slide. And I think the minimalist approach to communicating that point is the preferred and most effective way, I would say.
People will be watching you, so think about what to wear, your posture, and how it can affect your confidence. Advice from our speakers might help you to avoid potential wardrobe malfunctions.
It's quite individually determined by the presentation, because in this job we give presentations in other countries, in the UK, to various different people with very different expectations of what professional dress and behaviour is going to be like. The default assumption that I always have is that I will dress smartly, so jacket and shirt, not usually jacket and tie, because I find it sort of constricts my movement a bit.
So I think for me, it's really important to wear something that is comfortable and is authentic.
Good positioning is an important tool that can enhance your performance, improve your connection with your audience, maintain their attention, and improve their understanding of your topic. Our academics discuss dynamic ways to use this to your advantage.
I'm usually somebody who moves when I'm presenting, so I am not very good at standing still or sitting still, so I will move my arms, I will pace around a little bit. I'll try and make sure I'm engaging. If it's a big stage, I'll try and make sure I'm engaging both sides of the room and not just standing in one place. One thing that I try to be conscious of is not to stand in front of my slides so that my shadow is going to be blocking their view, or that I'm blocking somebody's view of the slides.
In conventional lectures, the lectern is an anchoring point, but it can also be something of a barrier between the presenter and the audience. And so if circumstances permit, and particularly if you are wearing a roving microphone, you might wish to move out from behind that protective shield and engage on a more personal level.
Starting well happens before you start presenting. Make friends with your audience. Welcome individuals as they come. Thank them for coming. Put them and your fellow presenters at ease.
So one kind of trick that comedians do when they come on stage, you'll see it a lot, is when they will walk on stage and they will say the first thing that they think that people have in their heads. So it is often just explaining verbally out loud what people might be thinking, and that just relaxes people immediately. I did something when I would go on stage that I would always walk in and say, I know I'm a lot taller than you think I would be. It's on YouTube, but you obviously can't see me stood up, so when people are like, God, you're a lot taller. So that would be a way just to kind of relax the audience and be like, yeah, I was thinking that. So that is a trick just to get, so whether it's a very difficult, topic that you're challenging that day, or it's a challenge is not particularly popular, coming out and saying that straight off the bat can be quite disarming for an audience.
Well, not infrequently, you will perhaps know the other presenters in your session and may have lectured alongside them in the past. That's not always the case, and sometimes you're being introduced to someone from a different field of study or expertise. It's great if you have the opportunity to try and get to know them a little ahead of time, understand where they're coming from, and the kind of topics they're going to be covering with a view to making your contribution complementary rather than a duplication.
Introducing yourself well helps introduce the flow of your presentation. Here are some tips for a strong start.
So I nearly always start with hello, my name is, and so hello, my name is Kerry, and depending on the setting, I will then sometimes say my name is Kerry Calvo or my name is Dr. Kerry Calvo, but very often I will start with hello, my name is Kerry, because I want to engage with people on that kind of level. And again, it depends a little bit about cultural sensitivities. If I'm somewhere where there's much more of a hierarchy, where it's more important to have that degree of authority, perhaps, then I might say Dr. Calvo rather than introducing myself as Kerry. And then I would explain where I've come from and what my role is in that setting.
So I'll start off with an overview of what to expect. And then as we go through, there'll always be like subtitle pages throughout the presentation, again, just to help guide the audience through the sessions.
Once in your stride, it's important to maintain engagement with the audience. We suggest telling stories and adding images. Do not offend, don't talk politics, and always use inclusive language. Humour might work if you are good at it, but remember, everything should serve to illustrate a point in your presentation.
I think it's really important to kind of have that sort of monitoring of yourself, your environment, your audience as you're going along. And it can be quite hard to do, but there's certainly, for me, whatever I'm doing, even if I'm just on my own speaking to a computer, is to have a little bit of a fly on the wall kind of viewpoint that's kind of giving me kind of information about how is all this going as it's progressing.
You know when people are on side, when they're kind of making eye contact, when they're, I mean, I'm not sure, I've never done an academic lecture before, but I'm sure that one can tell when you're performing or when you're giving a lecture whether you can tell whether the audience is with you. If they're not, then there's always opportunities to win them round, and that is just by taking a break, a breather, and almost starting afresh. Give it 10 seconds, 50 seconds, take a drink of water, check in with the audience, see how they're doing.
By engaging with the audience more, so not standing behind a podium, you can really judge from faces. I find when eye contact is being avoided, something has gone wrong. And when eye contact is being met consistently, then things are going right. And that's normally the guide to whether to change gears a little bit.
How not to be boring. Become an actor. Don't stand still. Say interesting stuff. Be relevant. Provide variety. Engage and be personable. Give something of yourself.
So, not being boring. I mean, ultimately, it's about telling a story. Like, stories are something that we as human beings absolutely love. We love stories. So, trying to explain the point or explain your thesis over to someone in a way that almost feels like a story can be incredibly engaging for people and is a much more effective way of people learning.
Well, I would use notes if I really had to. So, for example, if I was called to talk about something at the last minute and I wasn't quite sure I'd get everything in that I needed to, I wouldn't hesitate to use notes. But largely, I try to do it without notes because I'm lucky enough to be teaching things that I'm quite confident about most of the time. The relationship with the slides, I think my main thing is to always be aware that the audience are going to be hearing you talk and looking at you possibly, but also having to look at the slides. So I'm really, really conscious of that when I think about how the two match up together.
I think there are some basic rules about keeping your audience engaged. Don't speak in a monotone. Don't drone. Be somewhat animated. Modulate your speech. Ask questions of the audience along the way. Bring them in.
It is possible to lose the attention of your audience, but you can always get back on track. Here's some advice and methods you can use to do this.
So usually for me, that would be a cue. If there are lots of people starting to look at it fidgety, looking at their phones, looking like they're perhaps not engaging, although it's very difficult to tell now because it might be that people are looking something up that you've just talked about, or it might be that people are tweeting about it or engaging in that way. So I think it's worth being mindful about why people might be doing that. But if it feels to me like the energy has changed in the room, that people are starting to lose interest, then that's the point I would usually change direction slightly. That's where I will flex on. I may have one thing that I'm about to talk about on my slides, but I'll reflect in the moment.
Well, it kind of depends on whether the whole group appears a little bit distracted, uncomfortable, shuffling in their seats, or whether it's just one or two people. I think if it's one or two people, you can kind of use the sort of teacherly classroom control technique. Certainly in a big live presentation at a conference, I wouldn't single audience members out and start calling them to account. But certainly using things like silence can cause people to look up because they're not expecting a silence, so they'll look up to see what's going on. So kind of gentle things to kind of bring back people's attention that may have strayed inappropriately.
I think trying to get my audience back on board if I see that they're wondering, if they're drifting, if they've lost attention or focus. I try and remember when I do that, what are the reasons that I am not engaged. Sometimes I genuinely need to respond to something. Sometimes I've just, I'm tired, I need a change of pace or a change of scenery. And so I try and channel that in the activities that I use to engage the audience. Sometimes I know if you're giving a long presentation, I like to talk. So sometimes I'm like, I just need to talk. And so I give them an activity of something focused on the presentation or the topic that they can talk about. If they want to engage with their friends, if they want to use their phone, if there's something that I can ask them that they will need to use their phone to look up just to get their fingers moving. If that's something that they need to do to release that bit of energy, then I'll try and embrace it as much as possible.
You might inadvertently upset an audience member. What are the best ways to handle this type of situation?
So if somebody's got emotional and rushed out of the room, you don't necessarily want to call everyone's attention to it in the moment, but you would make sure to connect with them and provide them aftercare and acknowledge that something difficult happened for them afterwards.
I think, again, it's a time to just reflect on what's going on in the session. If I've got somebody who's clearly getting very upset, and sometimes if we're talking about particularly emotive topics, then that can happen. If I know I'm going to be talking about an emotive topic, then I would try and preface that at the beginning of the talk with some of the things I talk about may touch a nerve with you. Please feel free to leave the room if you need to. You can talk to me afterwards if you want to, or I'll signpost some support. If it's something which is quite unexpected, I again would try and, if somebody can go out with somebody else, or if you can just, signal to say, could somebody just check on them, or, then I would do that.
If you are challenged, there are productive ways to handle it, so that it won't disrupt the flow of your presentation. Our speakers describe the best way to navigate a tricky situation.
In terms of heckling, because most of my work is with education and with student interaction, then I guess our heckling takes the form of students who might ask awkward questions, or I have had in the past, less so now that I'm getting older and greyer, but I've had people try to challenge my authority on things and say, what's the relevance of this, and isn't it more important to know about? I try not to enter into an argument with somebody if they're trying to be deliberately provocative, but to acknowledge what they've said. Sometimes you do have to stand your ground, and if you've got a student who's saying, well, what's the point of these soft skills? We need hard clinical science. Then I will say, well, this is why this is useful. This is how it will complement the science. And so to try and explain how those things fit together.
If somebody's heckling or somebody's asked a question that you don't know the answer to, acknowledging that in the moment is really, really important. Because certainly somebody heckling or causing problems for other people in the audience, or learners in a teaching session, it disadvantages everybody in the audience, not just you. And actually, if you're on the stage and you've got the mic, I kind of think it's my responsibility to deal with that for everyone else at stake.
If someone's being difficult, you normally ask them to leave. When it comes to the world of comedy, hecklers they're kind of almost always a positive thing. Because if they heckle something and it's very funny, then the audience laughs, and then, hey, they're doing their job for me, so that's fantastic. If they're not being funny, they're being a nuisance to everybody who is there, then that is very simple. You just kind of get rid of them from the from the venue.
What happens if a film clip does not play, or the IT fails completely? A good presenter who knows their stuff should be able to deliver the talk without audio visuals. Best practice is to plan for unforeseen circumstances.
And I always like to have a sort of plan B and a plan C in terms of technology as well. I do a lot of work with iPads and working on Apple products, and so I always like to make sure that I can then transfer that to a setting that might be using something like a PC. So I have cables that will transfer from one to the other. I'll have a version on a memory stick. I'll have a version emailed to myself, so that I've got lots of ways of accessing my presentation if one thing fails. I've had situations where the technology has failed completely and the projector has gone. And so then I've had to do the session without the slide. And so it's useful to have a plan B in that situation as well, where I then went, right, well, it's okay, I've got a printed version of this, and we'll just go through using that as a prompt.
I think always have backup plans ready. And something that I find is a particular advantage of not having word-heavy slides is that you really don't necessarily need to project them if you have some handouts and you have other ways of communicating what it is that you're trying to get across. I think another thing that I've sort of learned over the last couple of years is never to let the practical considerations make a full start to the presentation. So you don't want to start by saying, oh, let's give it a few more minutes, or I'm sorry, the cable's not working. You always want to start with a summary of what you're going to say and make it a strong start. And then you can then go back and say, and we're going to finish a bit early because of this, that, and the other. But I find a full start really sets up a bad presentation.
You will know if things have gone well if the audience clap or come to the front to speak to you. Asking for feedback will help you in your next presentation.
So be willing to accept feedback, especially when that's live feedback, because I think sometimes if you respond negatively or you shut down feedback, sometimes you're embarrassed or you might not have the answer. It can be perceived in a certain way and that can lose the audience's attention. So I think try and bring things on board, even if you don't know the answer, don't be afraid. I think sometimes it's quite nice when students see that you don't know everything and that's okay. There's a lesson in that for them too. Be willing to admit when you might have got something wrong or you might be corrected. You might just say, rather than saying, oh no, that's not right, you say, okay, actually, that's interesting. I'm going to have a look at that. This is a way, this is where I might go to search. This is where you can check yourself. So empower the students as well. And I think if you have that engagement, if people are willing to have that conversation, even if it's negative feedback, it means they've been listening.
The audience is there for a reason. Like, engage them, use them, talk to them, ask them questions. And so often I see kind of in presentations, people will almost feel scared to engage with the subjects that they're talking to, because ultimately they are the ones who are learning. So just have open dialogue with the people who are watching in the audience, ask them what they think, how they think it could be improved. And that's also the same like during a lecture and at the end of the lecture. Be like, was there a bit where you didn't enjoy it or you slightly fell off?
Finally, here's a selection of the best tips and tricks our speakers can offer.
The reason you've chosen to deliver this is probably something that you're familiar with, that you've got competency in. And even if it's something new that you've discovered, you're probably interested in it. So share that enthusiasm as much as you can and try and have fun with it, because it's a fantastic experience to teach someone or help someone coming into that field of what you enjoy and what you love. And if you can share that with them, then hopefully that will bring you some joy too.
I think for you as a presenter and for your audience, authenticity is really important. So being yourself, introducing yourself as yourself, talking about who you are in relation to the institution, and actually using what we might call in academic circles that authorial voice to bring some coherence in terms of your identity to the whole presentation. Even if you're doing an academic presentation, there may be a role for you to actually talk about your own role and the relation between that and your academic arguments.
I didn't for a long, long time utilize audience interaction or engagement, and that can make it feel very, in a comedy work, it can feel very in the moment and unique to the audience's experience. And so often that now has become the cornerstone of the shows that I do, is talking to the audience and listening to what they say, because that can take the show in a completely different direction. Whereas previously when I started, I thought, okay, right, the stuff, the material that I've written is good enough. I don't need to kind of talk to anybody, but ultimately that's where you get the real gems and the bits you don't expect by engaging with the audience.